Welcome back to the Scripture Lounge. Once again, we're excited to welcome the Reverend Dr. John Cater, all the way from Hong Kong, who continues reflecting with us about the readings for this week, which are quite interesting. Where would you like to start, John?
Well, we probably should start at the beginning, the Old Testament, with that amazing passage from Ezekiel, the Valley of Dry Bones.
We all feel some of that right now.
Absolutely. I think the great question is that mortal shall these bones live, and certainly there are moments in the history of the Hebrew people and of the Jewish people when it really did seem as if these bones didn't have much life left. They didn't have much possibility of life left. I mean, most recently we certainly had the experience of the Holocaust when so many Jewish people lost their lives, but that's been an experience of the people from the very beginning, and Ezekiel was certainly writing at a time when there didn't seem to be much hope. And the Valley of Dry Bones, it reminds me of some of those pictures of places that you see where, for whatever reason, especially erosion or something, and you get all these fossil bones exposed, and archaeologists sort of go wild because instead of having to dig, they just have to go and pick up the bones, and then of course you have to piece them all together. And there's this kind of vision of Ezekiel just looking into a valley and seeing nothing but bones. But of course these are human bones, and these are in his mind and his imagination, the bones of his own people. And the question that comes to him from God is there any hope for these bones? It looks like it's all over. And there are other places in the Old Testament, and particularly in the Psalms, where you get that same feeling that there might not be any hope. It might all be over. And Ezekiel has this very clear vision, this very clear sense that that's not true. We think it is, but it isn't. And then I love the imagery of the spirit, which is wind, and probably most of the people who are listening to this conversation will have heard. Whether they remember it, I don't know, but I'm sure that we've all at some point explained that in Hebrew, the word for wind and the word for breath and the word for spirit are all the same word. And so it takes us three words to say what the Hebrew people could say in one word. And so the wind blows, but the wind is the spirit of life. And the spirit of life starts this wonderful, almost kind of dance of the bones. And you get the bones coming together, and then the sinews come and the muscles come, and then all of a sudden the flesh comes and they're put back together. And it's this just amazing vision, I think, I love the idea of the bones sort of dancing around as they get sort of sorted out. The wind is doing what the archaeologists have to do with the fossil bones. They're getting all put back together again. And you could do wonderful sort of dramatic things with acting out the vision of dry bones.
I think one of the oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just thinking about how, in Lent, I love the word mortal. What if we went around in Lent, we committed ourselves to addressing each other mortal? It seems to me like we started Lent with what I like to call, Science Wednesday. It's the most scientific day the church has because it's totally scientific. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. I mean, and we have the courage to say we're setting at least one day apart to contemplate death, our mortality, and yet we base that on the kind of hope that can come from accepting that limitation of life on this planet. And I think it's the difference between what I'd like to say is the difference between optimism and hope, because as a faith should bring hope, not just, well, things will get better, and and I think this is a time all of us are facing an option here. Are we just trying to be optimistic? That can be exhausting. That can be like grabbing for little
especially right now.
Yeah, but hope is the foundation of our faith. And so this is a tremendous opportunity, I think, that as we look at the dry bones of the news, and that we can actually choose our faith, choose that, not denial, to say, this, we're going through a hard time. It's not Pollyanna. It's like looking at the hard, the bones, but choosing to actually walk through that with some intentionality and hope.
I think that's absolutely true. Hope is not being Pollyanna. Hope is being hope is starting from being realistic. When you say, "Remember that we are dust, and to dust we shall return," that's the truth. And thinking of last week, and how important it is to see the truth. And how often we don't see the truth. I don't like to remember that I'm, especially at this point in my life, I don't like to remember about mortality. But that's a fact of life, and yet we are not hopeless people. We are, and Paul goes through this over and over and over again. And two things come to mind. One is a Lenten sermon that I heard several years ago. And in which it was pointed out that the dust that we're made from is stardust. The dust that we're made from is the remnant of the Big Bang that first created the stars. And I think it's our mortality is one of the many ways that we often don't remember, but need to see our connection to the whole of creation. Shortly after that sermon, very shortly after that sermon, my cousin died, and I preached, and I quoted that sermon and that idea in the context of a funeral sermon, and it struck me, it struck me, and it struck everybody as being so on target. On one hand, we are mortal. Our mortality itself brings us into harmony with the whole of creation, which, as we all know, is one of the things that we haven't been very good at. St. John's people are a lot better at it than most people. But to remember all the time that our mortality is one of the things that links us to the creation. But then you have this section from Paul, which is, like so much of Paul, is so easy to misunderstand, where he talks about the flesh and the spirit as if somehow he doesn't want to pay attention to the fact that we are bodies, not that we have bodies, but that we are bodies. And when he talks about flesh, and I've always tried to remember this when I read Paul, because otherwise it could give you heartburn. When Paul talks about the flesh, he's not talking really about our bodies. Well, he is talking about our bodies per se, but he's talking about our bodies away from God. Our New Testament professor way back when made such an impression on me because he kept telling us, don't remember, he's not talking about bodies. He's talking about who we are on that very everyday plane of life where we just sort of go along and we don't notice the fact that we live as part of a much larger dimension of reality. And when he talks about flesh and spirit, I think, at least my New Testament professor persuaded me, and I've never had any reason to doubt him. When Paul is talking about flesh and spirit, he's talking about living as if God didn't matter, living as if we really don't have very much to do with God, and living with the realization that that wind of life is our breath, and so we're spiritual people. And when he talks about that tension or that conflict between flesh and spirit, what he's talking about is, that conflict between that we have in us, between being dry bones and being blown on by God's wind and made alive. And so I think there's a wonderful kind of connection between what Ezekiel saw and what Paul certainly saw, certainly experienced. It's interesting. Sitting in this apartment in solitary confinement for a lot of the time, I've read so much more than I usually do, and I recently read two books that made the same point from totally different perspectives. And one was a book by Marcus Borg, although it was actually put together by his wife after he died, and it's a collection of articles about who Jesus is. It's called Days of Awe and Wonder, and his point is, and it's his quite, I think, quite remarkable and sometimes unique way of looking at who Jesus is. He sees Jesus really as somebody who lives with this awareness that what we just see every day around us, what looks normal, what looks everyday, is only part of the story. And there's a whole other dimension of reality that we could call spirit. And in that dimension of reality, all the things that keep us apart don't really belong anymore. And it's a really quite amazing way for me of thinking about when we talk about who Jesus is, as the person who really does live all the time with that sense that there is a dimension that we call spirit, or we call the holy. He lived with that all the time, and it shapes his life of faith, and if we're up to it, it shapes our life of faith.
There's this wonderful story, and some people have actually made a little short film about it, based on, actually, I think it was a commencement speech by David Foster Wallace called "This is Water." And it starts out with these three fish, one an older fish and two smaller fish, and they're swimming and they're approaching each other. Two smaller fish are approaching the older fish. And as they pass each other, the older fish sees the younger fish and said, "How's the water, boys?" And they swim along for a while, and the younger fish say, "What's water?" And he kind of makes this point. There's this spiritual activity all around us, and we're so immersed in it. It's not that the spirit is so far away, like you have to climb some mountain. It's a matter that we're so immersed in life. If we just take the time to see the person next to us, 6 feet away from us in line, or notice things that we don't normally pay attention, because we're moving so quickly, that this is an opportunity for us to kind of sit back and experience the spirit more in this time.
The wind blows, as Jesus says, the wind blows where it will, and you just don't know where it's going to end up.
So during this time, we feel like there's a lot there's this talk about the curve and flattening the curve during this virus, and a lot of anxiety around are we getting this soon enough, or so on and so forth. So then we come to this gospel reading today where Jesus is late. Lazarus has died, and how do you look at that passage in light of the anxiety that we're all feeling today?
I think the story of Lazarus is such an amazing story on so many levels. It seems like Jesus deliberately doesn't go to take care of things. He waits 2 or 3 days and then goes to Bethany. And yet when he gets there, he's so moved that he weeps, which I think should take care of any arguments that anybody has that Jesus isn't a real human being. In this moment, he's overwhelmed by grief, but he's also in this relationship with the two sisters and Lazarus, and it's, Lazarus is dead. Mortality has happened. Ash Wednesday has come true. And not only has it come true, but and I think John, being the good storyteller, makes him actually be there late enough that you really don't want to go in that tomb because things are going on and it's not very pleasant. And Jesus says, no, this is not the end. One of the things that I've always thought about when I think about the Lazarus story is that Lazarus still died. Lazarus is not walking around somewhere. If you go to Israel, you're not going to run into Lazarus. He comes out of the grave, but he still, at some point, gets a virus and dies. So this is not, in a sense, an Easter story. This is not a story the way that the resurrection of Christ is an Easter story, because as Paul says, Christ being raised from the dead doesn't die anymore. Lazarus does. Lazarus, just like his sisters, is buried in the grave. But I think the imagery here is really not unrelated to the Valley of Dry Bones and the passage from Paul, that in the presence of Jesus, life happens. One of the things that I've been talking about and boring people about, because some people would say it's about the only thing I ever preach about, what we call the reign of God, or what borrowing from Bernard Dozier, I now call the dream of God. And everything that Jesus does and everything that Jesus says, in one way or another, is related to the reign of God, to the dream of God. And one of the things that he keeps doing is giving us signs of what the reign of God is like. What is that realm of spirit? What is that other dimension that one don't notice? What's it like? And one of the things that it's like is that it is today, where it's about life. So for me, the raising of Lazarus is one of Jesus' greatest, maybe the greatest sign of Jesus making the dream of God come true, by telling us, in about as dramatic way as possible, what God is about is life, and about bringing people together. Because one of the amazing things of the story is, Lazarus Mary and Martha get Lazarus back, and the end of the story, when Jesus says, cut off those cloths that you wrapped his body in and let him go. This is a tremendous sign of how God, the wind of God, lets us go from all the things that we need to be let go of. And so for me, it's this tremendous sign of just how potent God's Spirit is when we notice that it can even bring Lazarus out of his tomb.
I was, I always loved this passage so much. And the first time I preached on it at St. John's, we had a wonderful man in the congregation who went on to be an actor in down in Hollywood. He's since passed away, but a good friend, Fred Oakes. And so we decided what we would do is we'd wrap him up as tight as we could get him wrapped up in these cloths. And I brought him out, literally wheeled him down in a dolly in front of the congregation, and I pointed out to everybody, this is what resurrection looks like if we don't do anything. What strikes me is that Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, but he doesn't untie him. He leaves it up to the people. The people need to untie and let each other loose. And it seems to me that part of our challenge today is to find ways we can let people go, the ways we can help them find the freedom to be who they were created to be. And that takes us. It's not going to, it's not like a zap from above necessarily. It's about us working together to solve these problems.
I was not at church that Sunday, but that's why those are the things that make me love St. John's. I really wish I'd been there for that service. But it's a wonderful point. It's a wonderful point.
Well, John, would you? We're kind of coming to the close of this session here.
Sure.
Oh mortal, are you up for Palm Sunday?
Sure. I'm up for Palm Sunday. Why not?
Then we would love to have everybody tune in next week. Maybe everyone should bring a palm, and at least we can see each other with a palm in our hands.
If you look over my left shoulder, you can see the palm from last year still stuck in the little telephone that I communicate with the front door with.
Oh, I know. I just see it. Yes.
I'll bring it closer for next week.
Great. Well, thanks again, John. It's always
Thank
great
you so much. It's terrific to be with you and the folks from St. John's.
And we'll see you next week.
Stay well. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye now.